So today I believe that we need to talk about censorship and the reason why everybody who cares about their future or the future of our republic should be aggressively opposed to the censorship that's rapidly being implemented today in our nation. I also want to discuss some things that you can do to bypass the big brother censors of today. So first, let's clarify, lest anyone is still confused out there. Censorship is exclusively a tool to protect the narrative. It is not a tool to protect the truth. The establishment elite, whether they be in the political class, the bureaucracy, the modern titans of technology, or the legions of others that are paid to basically be the narrative pushers, I mean, these guys love censorship. They love it. I can't emphasize this enough. They love everything about censorship, shadow banning, silencing, or canceling all who dare question their manufactured narratives. Now the question is why? Well, this should be obvious, but clearly if you are in power and you want the people to believe that your narrative justifying a bloated, wasteful budget, for example, or perhaps a stupid excuse to start a war, or some pathetic justification for why your school system is an abysmal failure, you must push a narrative that you want the people to believe. You need the people to believe the story or the lie, or maybe just a partial lie. I mean, let's face it, it is a lot harder to successfully push this narrative if alternative voices are out there providing different perspectives. So that's why we have to have censorship. Now, before we get into more specifics on what modern censorship looks like and what you can do about it, I want to encourage you to share, like, and subscribe to this channel. Right down below. I know from video analytics that roughly half the people watching this video right now, you've probably subscribed to this channel. So if you're one of those who hasn't subscribed yet, just go ahead and take a second, it only takes a second, and click on the subscribe button below. You can help this channel get more visibility. Since I'm on the topic of censorship today, please note this channel is typically shadow banned by those in power. So the best way to spread the message is to share this video link directly with others via text or email or on social media if you can. Every time you do that, I'm sure a bureaucrat gets angry. So back to censorship and the desperate need for those in power to protect their narrative. Now keep in mind, this is what really matters to those in power. I believe that the fundamental problem that exists with big government, and particularly abuse of government today, is this concentrated benefits, distributed costs dilemma. I brought this up in the past as it relates to kind of grant grifting, taxation, cancel culture, and this expanding bloat of big government. And let me explain what I mean by this. The concentrated benefits and distributed cost dilemma essentially means that those who reap the benefits from the tax or the chosen narrative, the grant grifting operation, or the expanding bloat of the administrative state, for example, for the small cadre of beneficiaries, they really, really benefit. I mean, they collect millions or sometimes even billions of dollars. Their power is enhanced and their goals are directly and immediately achieved by whatever they're focused on. So they're generally willing to do almost anything to get their goals achieved, and they will do everything they can to achieve it. And it makes sense. I mean, they have the most to gain from the new law or the new policy or the grant or whatever it is they're pushing. The benefits are directly concentrated with them, and it's usually the pretty small cadre of elite beneficiaries. However, on the other side of this dilemma, of this equation, we have the distributed costs. And the distributed costs tend to be increases in taxes, impacts of regulations, or kind of small slices of our freedom being taken away with each new agenda. And basically, this is you and I. We're the unwashed peasants and peons in this modern administrative state. So we tend to shoulder the burden of paying for these incremental costs and abuses. But usually the individual costs, they're distributed, just spread across as just another maybe 5% increase on that tax, or just an increase in your power bill, or perhaps it's just a restriction on your ability to remodel your home, or something relatively small in your overall life experience. And sure, you might be annoyed or you're even angry. But the incremental increase in cost to you or your family or business usually seems survivable. So just like you've survived similar damages in the past, you might raise a fuss, but is it really worth marching in the streets or taking hundreds of hours or spending a good percentage of your remaining income to push back? Well, usually it does not. It doesn't make any sense. So this is a pretty simple equation for most people. And for most people, I believe they just take the hit, hunker down to survive, and then they hope it won't be so bad next time. From a liberty and freedom perspective of government, this is what we call kind of the death from a thousand cuts. And most people won't put their lives on the line to oppose just that one next cut that's coming. The average person just hunkers down and they try to survive. Now, again, keep in mind, on the concentrated benefits side of this equation, there's literally nothing that they won't do to keep their grift going. I mean, they have the potential to gain massive power and resources, whereas you and I, kind of the little people, we just pay a slightly larger percentage of our income or feel our freedoms are just that much more constrained. But it just doesn't seem like the hill that we want to die on, and so we can see this highly motivated elite. They're going to crush all opposition to their schemes if we dare to stand up and push back. So let me give you a few kind of quick and simple examples of this so that you can see how critical censorship is to this equation and this very predictable narrative protection racket that it's really designed to protect. A few years ago, I was attending a variety of public meetings in the City of Olympia and in Thurston County in Washington State, which is where I live today. And I was noticing an ever-expanding group of militant, aggressive, and intense organizations of kind of nonprofits that were pushing for ever-expanding grants, taxes, and regulations to support this exploding homeless industrial complex in the city. And homeless drug addict camps were basically popping up all over the place, and the city was starting to decay right before our very eyes. I mean, keep in mind, the City of Olympia is the capital city for Washington State. It's filled with bureaucrats and the political class, and most of them basically owe their living to the state one way or the other. The downtown Olympia precincts, they vote very left. I mean, they typically elect crazy loons to political positions in government. Just look at the City of Olympia. So despite this, the people who live in Olympia, they're actually not all crazy. And many of them could see the damage that was being done by this widespread expansion of kind of these drug addiction tent cities that were popping up in their community. So many of them attended city council meetings to speak in opposition to the expansion of these tent cities for drug addicts. And there was one neighborhood association who clearly spoke up against the program. And this neighborhood's actually located in a precinct that votes almost exclusively for Democrat candidates. I believe there were maybe 6 lonely Republican voters out of like 600 or so voters there. So this wasn't a partisan thing at all. And the Olympia City Council consists exclusively of Democrats. I mean, there hasn't been a Republican there in years, so mostly the extreme leftists. And the residents who spoke up were clearly Democrats. And the neighborhood is made up almost entirely of Democrat voters. But after that testimony and really strong opposition to these tent city drug camps, militant activists who wanted to expand these camps slashed the tires of hundreds of vehicles parked on the streets in that neighborhood. Now, I spoke to a Democrat friend of mine who lived there, and while getting his tires replaced at the local tire store the next morning, he realized it was filled with people from his neighborhood. So they got the message, and their vocal opposition essentially ended after that. Now, the City of Olympia has expanded their grant grifting to the homeless industrial complex by many millions of dollars per year since that day. And this includes additional taxes and expanding drug camp support, free stuff forever. Those who receive this cash and stuff in these grant grifting operations, of course, they siphon most of it into their own pockets, and they want to build their empires. Very little actually gets to the drug addicts who are killing themselves in the streets, and then, of course, preying on the community to support their habit. So the people running these organizations, though, they have a great desire to receive the millions of dollars in concentrated benefits that the taxpayers of the City of Olympia will provide them. So slashing a few tires, a bit of targeted arson maybe, and loud protests, these were really just a very small price to pay for the large volumes of cash that they planned to take. Now, the local neighbors, on the other hand, they rapidly got the message. Their voices would be silenced, mostly self-silenced as they ran the math in their head, because even liberals can do math at this type, and they realize it's a pretty simple equation. I mean, maybe I don't want to keep paying $800 every few days for a new set of tires, and I sort of don't want my house burned down, so maybe I don't want to be verbally harassed on Nextdoor or Facebook or when I'm at the grocery store, so I think I'll just pay a bit more in taxes and leave this fight to somebody else. That is the distributed cost dilemma. Now, another local example that I experienced, and keep in mind, examples like this are really legion, including in the red states. Don't think you're immune. Just look near you. You'll find stories just like this. So another local example I was involved in, basically digging into our local kind of sleepy conservation district in Thurston County. This is a relatively small government entity with a kind of archaic and bizarre method of electing 5 local commissioners. Their primary source of cash comes from a small property tax fee that they levy, and then they hire employees to write grant documents so they can get more cash. So to the handful of senior staff on the inside of this and the lucky recipients of the grant cash, they're going to do literally anything legal or illegal to protect their turf and the cash machine that just keeps coming their way. In a rare example of elected officials trying to actually restore some type of government accountability, they actually had a handful of commissioners who were elected and who actually wanted to kind of crack down on some of these kickback schemes that they uncovered. The senior employees were conveniently sending tens of millions of dollars in salmon habitat restoration dollars, for example. She was sending them to her husband's company. And of course, other types of just basically typical unaccountable self-dealing that was going on. Now, by government standards, this was really small ball stuff, millions of dollars on a cumulative basis for sure, but really nothing compared to the average state agency, for example. And yet this group of corrupt employees and equally corrupt recipients of grant cash and travel vouchers and other petty kickback schemes, they moved heaven and earth with lawsuits and friendly newspaper attacks and potential grant grifters mobbing and hounding the elected officials until they were removed from office for daring to question the approved narrative. And there was really no possible financial reward to these guys for daring to expose the truth and confront the corruption. Instead, it cost them large sums of money, years of wasted time, and endless protests, lawsuits, and public abuse from the grant grifters. And this was also a good example of how it's hard to motivate the public to potentially be exposed to that type of abuse to, say, eliminate this wasteful and completely corrupted self-dealing public grant grifting scheme, when they really would only save a small sum of money on an annual basis on their property taxes. It's rare to find people who are actually willing to take that type of hassle. So the distributed costs of small amounts of personal benefit versus the concentrated graft and grift that defines their very existence for the bureaucrats and the insiders who profit from the scheme, there's no comparison. Which basically brings us back to censorship and why it matters to all of us. The censors have everything to gain in their efforts to censor, silence, and cancel all who dare question the approved narrative. It is their very career, their life goals, financial future, and the empire building that is clearly at stake each time. So there's probably nothing that they won't do to obtain the objective, this holy grail of all censors, the total elimination of all alternative narratives. And the alternative to censorship, of course, is true free speech, the ability to publicly and openly debate and support your position, goals, and agenda with those with whom you disagree. In the end, the public will decide which objective, goal, project, or direction that they actually want to take. And this is the theoretical free marketplace of ideas, and again, in theory, the best one should prevail. But even if it doesn't, if the public latches onto a bad idea, it can be exposed and we can change the course of that policy or idea. This is what makes free speech and the concept of free speech so powerful. But it's also so scary to our political elite. Because our political elite are terrified that we, that means you and me, that the general public, that we will begin to realize that the emperor has no clothes, that they are terrified that we will learn just how corrupt and incompetent that they've become. And they certainly don't want us to realize how their horrible decisions in the past have created even larger negative society-wide impacts. I mean, moving forward right now, this is why their narrative is so important to them. And by the way, this isn't really a partisan subject, or at least it isn't necessarily a partisan focus. Sure, in my home state of Washington and in Washington, D.C. today, of course, kind of the lefty fringe of the Democrat Party may run the political show. But the eternally bloated and growing bureaucracy, they don't really care whether you're red or blue. The party of bureaucracy just wants to keep the budgets growing, the power expanding, and they want to be less accountable all the time. The bureaucracy will strive to do this regardless of which party appears to be in power. So back to censorship and basically protecting the narrative. When the party of bureaucracy, corruption, and government bloat needs to keep the spigot on to full blast just to keep their pockets lined and pay off their friends and, of course, justify more of the same in the future, there's literally nothing that they won't do to keep the gravy train running. Nothing. So censorship is important, and frankly, it's an easy choice for them. Our federal and state free speech protections? Well, those are conveniently trampled on in the rush to protect the narrative. And I suspect that it's more important now than ever because the narrative is becoming more fragile. It's becoming more fractured. and obviously false as we kind of move forward and see what's actually happening today. So the other challenge that is creating is that it's a serious risk to the official narrative, is the fact that the distributed cost challenge is becoming harder to maintain because now the individual costs are increasing on the average person out there. That's you and I. It isn't so easy anymore to keep our heads down and just muddle along. So let me explain. A few years ago, the average person might have just tuned out the political rhetoric in the news because it just didn't have much impact in their daily life. Republican or Democrat, I mean, who really cares? Time passes by and the average person just doesn't notice. However, most people see hard times coming right now. And they kind of realize that our political class is not making it better. Escalating crime in the cities, for example, or the total collapse of public education. Maybe it's skyrocketing drug addiction beyond anything our nation's actually seen before, and then threats of potential world war. I mean, these things do tend to impact people, makes them think. And so, meanwhile, our political class has a bizarre obsession with pronouns. And they seem to want more foreign wars and increasing the bloat of government above all else right now. So the average person might be wondering why their kid isn't functionally literate by the 10th grade. Maybe they're wondering why they can't afford to buy a car or groceries, and their local store just gets shoplifted with impunity. Maybe they've even seen it. And yet they see these clowns in government obsessed about pronouns. The fact that average people see these things, and they start to wonder, what is going on with the political class? And this is a problem which can create risk to the officially approved narrative. Now, regular people who have these common sense observations are going to look for answers, because they're not going to find these answers in the state-controlled organs of media, not MSNBC or CNN, of course, or even Fox News. The polls all show kind of greater skepticism right now with the official approved narrative. This is a problem for our political elite. So just controlling the message of the Seattle Times, for example, King 5 News, and maybe the other controlled and approved messengers of the state, that may no longer be enough because increasingly people, they kind of get their news from somewhere else. Now, this is why censorship right now is so important to the political class. Yes, this is often partisan, but it is more than just blue team good and red team bad, although that's the common approved message that's distributed by the political class today. It is much more nuanced than this. Censorship is critical. It's mission critical, in fact, critical beyond almost everything else if they want to keep the gravy train going. And they want to avoid all responsibility for the horrific decisions that they have made in the past to get us to this place. Our political establishment wants to not just keep the gravy train flowing into their deep pockets, they want to also avoid any accountability for their corruption or poor choices. So the concentrated benefits that they're collecting at our expense is just so big, and the potential consequences for public exposure is potentially so extreme that total silencing, censorship, and the cancel culture that supports it, that's an easy choice for this crew right now. So we understand why they want to censor us and all who may question the official narrative. And of course, we understand their clear motivation to do so, basically anything necessary to keep the official narrative protected. And we understand the narrative is probably unsustainable, which just makes the establishment panic just that much more. So what can you and I do about it? Now, let me close with just a few baby steps, and these are steps I think that you can take, and in my next video I'm kind of planning to discuss some of these in a little bit more specificity. But first, realize that the official narrative and the high price that those in charge will extract from those who don't toe the line is seriously baked into the official media cake right now. This isn't either a red state or blue state thing either. The traditional media in your red state is just as corrupted by this trend right now. To specifically explain this at a state level, for example, there's no scenario where in my home state of Washington that you will ever hear any heterodox or independent thought expressed in the Seattle Times, The Stranger, and I really can't tell the difference anymore, the Tacoma News Tribune, the Spokesman Review, or any of the other traditional media outlets that still remain. They're in paywalled lockstep, and I feel sorry for anyone left who follows what these organs of the state have become. I mean, there is no realistic scenario where King 5 News or the other approved media channels are going to tell you the unvarnished truth, none at all. They will follow their marching orders, and what Governor Inslee or AG Bob Ferguson or the senior establishment tells them to report, that's what they're going to do, and they will all respond in lockstep. Every now and then, they might allow a silly approved kind of pro-con article, but even this pretense of objectivity is rapidly disappearing now today. So I would strongly suggest that you read or listen to these local media outlets only as a way to understand what you've been approved to know or believe. It is still helpful to understand the official narrative. It's in the same way that the Russians would read Pravda or the Chinese have their state-approved media. It's helpful to track the approved message, so I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But you need to develop your own local sources of information. And I'm not specifically telling you where to go because this is going to vary by where you live. But I encourage you to focus on local sources that provide original source documents and debate the merits or concepts being pushed by the official narrative that you see. You want to know actually what this alternative message is. If your local school district's pretending that their test scores are improving, find the people who are actually comparing the past test score data and the changing goalposts being used to project the false narrative. If you are experiencing an escalating crime wave in your community, find the people who are truly reporting real crime statistics. If you want to understand basically where we stand after the state legislature and governor get done attempting to trash our state with this most recent absurd legislative session, read what the legislators like Representative Jim Walsh and Jenny Graham maybe had to say about what just happened. If you don't find local news that you can trust, then perhaps join with others who basically share your passion about a local subject. Maybe it's the schools or your local city council, the crime situation, etc. Just find that and start doing your own research or find those who appear to be doing a good job and perhaps help them disseminate the truth that they've already collected. And finally, don't let the censors discourage you. I mean, this has happened before. The current big tech cooperation with the state is kind of a new thing in some ways, but this general effort at censorship, this has been tried many, many times in the past, even in our country, and it generally fails. It isn't always as obvious, but generally it does fail in the end. So be part of the change that you want to see. If Facebook or your other social media platforms won't let you speak, and they usually don't, change platforms. Find the ones with information that you find valuable and be engaged there. Focus locally because it's the local events, I believe, which impact you most directly. Now, in closing, I want to quote from an interview with Democrat presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's actually challenging Biden for the Democrat nomination right now. And he was recently interviewed, and he stated, and I just want to quote this because it really stands out to me, "There is no time in history when the people who were censoring speech were the good guys." And that's end quote. Now, that's a powerful and I believe very accurate statement to be made. And that's also true today because the people like our own Attorney General Bob Ferguson, who failed in his quest to implement a ministry of truth in our state, he's not a good guy. The efforts by the state to censor those of us who challenge their narrative, they are not the good guys. The big tech and big pharma corporations who want to censor us, they're not the good guys, obviously. But despite all the efforts to censor us, the truth does tend to find a way to undermine the big lie. So let's undermine it as quickly as we can so that we can find real solutions to the very real problems that we all face right now, regardless of which party we affiliate with or where we live. And I believe that starts with number one. You got to be willing to question authority. They fear your questions, and this is why they strive to censor us. Number two, we have to seek the truth and share the truth. I mean, this is how we best prepare for the future. And finally, I would say we need to show up. Do not cower in fear and do not be afraid, because in the end, the future belongs to those who show up.